Hi, my name is Tim M. West. I am a Cincinnati native that was born here in '72. I was raised, however, in Arkansas, Little Rock, and then a small town called Taylor. And I made my way back to Cincinnati to the Northside neighborhood in 2017. I use both he and they pronouns. I identify as queer, pansexual if it comes to that kind of specificity. So I've lived in Cincinnati. I moved here in November of 2017. A little bit before that, because I was in the process of closing a home that I still now live in. 2017, so a little over 5 years. Somewhat significant because I generally have a 3-year rule and then I'm out, and I've lived in a lot of different cities, New York, the Bay Area, Chicago, Houston, DC, Atlanta, and a lot of those are 3-year stints. So the fact that I've been here for 5, I think says a lot. And I think it's significant that I moved to Cincinnati because I wanted to set roots somewhere and nest and have an impact. And it's just ironic that I did so in the place where I was born. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting story there. So I did work for many years. I led Teach for America's LGBTQ initiative work, which is called its PRISM work, its PRISM Alliances. And we did conferences every year, usually one in the Deep South, one in the Midwest, because those often were like two of the more conservative areas where people needed support around LGBTQ issues in schools. We had done the conference in the Midwest in Chicago, and we'd done it in St. Louis. And so I was like, Cincinnati's in the Midwest. I was born there. Like, I've visited a few times. I've been a lifelong Bengals fan, so I'd come to a few games here before we got really good too. So that's significant because I ride or die here. And so I brought this education conference to Cincinnati. I met Elisa Hoffman, who was on the school board at the time, interestingly enough. And she was like, Tim, I'm like, you're from here. And she really kind of did a great ambassador job. And one of the things that she indicated to me was that Cincinnati had just passed an equity, a diversity, inclusion policy that protected trans kids. And of course, me knowing what I thought I knew about Cincinnati was like, not in Cincinnati. So we brought the conference here. And not only did I see how that work had happened unilaterally and unanimously by many members of the board, but I just saw a different version of Cincinnati than I had experienced before. There was queer community, there were Black queer communities, and I was like, this is actually something I could potentially be a part of, because I also knew there was room for growth and room for doing even more, but I wanted to feel like the seeds had been planted. Two of my close friends, Doug and Greg Cooper Spencer. Doug is a longtime Black gay author from Cincinnati who wrote a book called This Place of Men that I've always called my personal Brokeback Mountain, that talks about the lives of 2 young Black gay men in their teens growing up in Cincinnati. And so that book reconnected me to the city in some really important ways. And being able to be a part of Cincinnati's kind of, rejuvenation and sort of a space that's more inclusive. I was like, wow, we got a gay city council member that's openly gay. We had a gay man on the school board. And so those are things that that's a sign of a Cincinnati that's actually shifting, and also the ability to help Reginald Harris with his campaign for city council, and as at least to my knowledge, the first openly gay Black man on city council. So those are things I think, if I can continue to be a part of that, then this is a place I want to stay. I left Cincinnati, I think, as a 4-year-old. Okay. So my earliest memories are of here, but not many. I did come back. I think I met Greg and Doug Cooper Spencer at a book fair at Atlanta Black Pride. And so our tables happened to be next to each other. And at a lull in the activity, it's like, oh, tell me about your book. So tell me about your book. So I told him about my books, and he's like, oh, like I'm from Cincinnati. This book is, I'm like, Cincinnati? I was born in Cincinnati. So that started the conversation. When you're a little kid and you have to spell Cincinnati at like 5 years old, and you're like, is it 2 N's? Is it 2 T's? Like, I'm confused, right? Like, you just develop a connection. And so I said, yeah, I was born in Cincinnati. So we ended up developing a friendship, and they said, hey, anytime you want to come back and visit, come see us. And so I actually started visiting Cincinnati, and I think Doug may have been a part of getting me the gig I got in 2006, where I actually performed at Cincinnati Pride. That was my first experience of Cincinnati Pride. It was in Northside. It was like a smallish kind of Pride, but it was cool. I really enjoyed it. I had to have met them in either 2004 or 5. I'd have to really dig to figure out exactly the year, but I'm pretty sure it was 2004 or 5, because I had just published my first book, which is called Red Dirt Revival, A Poetic Memoir in 6 Breaths. I think I even referenced Cincinnati in my book a few times, because it's always been kind of, your birthplace is always a point from which everything else kind of happens. So in terms of coming out, it's interesting because there's a narrative that I was taught from my friend Karamo Brown, who many people know from Queer Eye. He and I are friends, and he let me in on this concept about letting people in, which is kind of a different way of defining the coming out process, because it doesn't make the person coming out the spectacle, and other people are reacting to that. It's like you're being yourself, and when you let people in, if they react negatively, they're the spectacle, they're the problem, they have to work through their stuff. And so I like to think of what I did as let people in. Of course, it was definitely a journey. The first person I came out to was my high school sweetheart. I was in Arkansas at the time. So when people ask me if I'm from Cincinnati, I can't tell them where I went to high school, because that's kind of the main qualifier here. Not that I was born in Cincinnati, but that I went to high school here. This had to be 88, maybe 89. And I was really struggling. I'm pretty sure it was 89, because I'd had a really bad bout with depression. I attempted suicide by taking a bunch of pills at one point. So, but I was also like captain of my high school basketball team. I was pretty much a straight A student. So in a lot of people's minds, like, I had everything going for me. How could I be depressed? And no one, because of how I present, suspected that it could have been that. We just didn't talk about those issues back in the 80s. And if you didn't present in a way that was stereotypically effeminate, like, no one ever questioned it. So when she asked me, and I said, I'm attracted to guys. And she said, well, how do you know? And I said, I just know, like, I developed crushes on guys and things like that. And I said, I've tried to fight it. I used to fast. I grew up in a religious household. And then I converted to LDS. So became a Mormon. And in both of those contexts, it was like not a good thing. And she had the most compassionate response, which was, I'm really sorry that you're going through this. And then her immediate response after that was, does that mean we have to break up? She did ask if I had like actually been with guys before, which I hadn't. So it was interesting that like people associated being queer or gay with like the actual act as opposed to the feeling, which I think is something that I continue to try to share with people, that that queerness to me is a heart thing. It's not a sex thing. And so that kind of opened the door. I think her compassion in that moment let me know that there are people in the world that weren't going to respond in a negative way. But I also knew, as a very poor kid in Southwest Arkansas, that it was either going to be sports or academics that helped me leave the state. And so once I got to college, then I felt like I could come out to other people. That's when I came out to my mom, who, was not, I used to think my mom might know. She said she knew something was different, but she didn't identify that particular thing. But she was compassionate as well. She was just like, are you okay? Like, I love you. Like, I don't understand it, but I love you. And I think that's an important narrative, because I think so often the narrative around Black people and Black families is that we're somehow more homophobic than any other groups of people. And I don't think that that's true, quite honestly, because I know so many examples of compassionate, loving, accepting families. Even in the book that Doug wrote, there was one family that wasn't, and there was another family that was like really supportive of their kid. So I thought just having that balanced perspective. And I also think that part of my being out is to demonstrate to younger people that, I think seeing yourself, that's something I didn't have. I couldn't identify in particular, a Black queer person. So I felt like a unicorn. And it's easy to sort of, for Black kids to grow up and thinking, if you only see Will and Grace or Ellen, that like, that's queer. Like, queer is like a thing white people do. Black people don't do that. And I'm like, that's so not true. But the more you learn about history and the intersection of Black and queer, it becomes really important. And I think that's for all people of color, for AAPI youth, for Latinx youth, for other youth, to be able to also see themselves represented in queerness. My first awareness, and this was actually before I met Doug and Greg. So meeting Doug and Greg was important because they were a queer, married, Black couple, both successful in their own lanes. And that was something I was like, they live in Cincinnati and they're like out. So that was the first step of like, oh, and they're writing books. Like, there's a Black gay author in Cincinnati. Wow, this is really great. Still really close with them. But I also remember in the 90s, legislation passing, I forget what it was called, Proposition something. And I distinctly remember how the Black church got weaponized against this ability to preserve rights for LGBTQ people. So it was really a bad feeling, because on the one hand, it was like gay people don't have rights, but it was pushed in the media like it was Black people's fault that this thing passed. And I was like, I don't think it's just Black people that are voting against it. But there was a mobilization of Black pastors and Black faith leaders that were against it. And I think so often it's this idea that like, well, we don't even have our Black rights yet. Like, I'm like, it doesn't work that way, that like we get rights in order. We're more likely to get our rights if we all get our rights. And we can't like say, okay, well, first let the men get their rights and then the women can get their rights. And like, that doesn't feel good to people. And you're not going to get your rights if other people don't feel like their rights are happening. So I think for me, seeing that get reversed was a huge signal to me that things were shifting, because I think in that period between that passing and it getting reversed, I was like, never going back there, don't want to be there. And I can only imagine people who lived here and left. And so I would meet people from Cincinnati and they would say, oh, I can't be there, or I can't be myself there. In particular, a lot of the Black queer folks that I met from Cincinnati was like, nope, if you want to be queer and you want to be out, you got to leave. And Doug's book, interestingly, speaks on that. Like, one of the characters leaves and goes to New York, and that's where they're able to be themselves and thrive. And they have this kind of pit in their stomach about coming back to Cincinnati to see family. And I think for me, a big driving force for reconnecting to my birthplace is seeing the potential for Cincinnati to be more inclusive and more welcoming and more intersectional, but also, the young people that I meet in the high schools and in different contexts, I don't want them to feel like I have to leave Cincinnati to thrive. Like, I want them to feel like if I choose to be here, it's because I can, not because I think there's people that have a lot of love for Cincinnati. And what I see now is this kind of revival of people who are from here that left. I call us like, we have a prodigal son crew. And it's like all these people that lived here or grew up here or are originally from here coming back because the city seems to have something to offer, and it seems to be able to be responsive to and inclusive of who they are. For a long time, what I would say is that, and particularly in the Black community, there's always been Black leaders here in Cincinnati who were part of the LGBTQ community, But there was also an unspoken don't ask, don't tell kind of policy, right? Like, oh, yeah, we kind of know that so-and-so is that way, but as long as they don't talk about it, we're fine. And I think the big shift since I came back in 2017 is I want people to feel like it's absolutely okay to be out. It's okay to be vocal. It's okay to claim both of your identities. It's okay to be queer in Black spaces. It's okay to be Black in queer spaces. And I think that's setting an example of the kind of place we're creating where people do want to come back. It's good. I mean, it's actually good for the city when you have that kind of inclusion. So when I first came back, I was disappointed because Simon's was closed. Simon Says, I think, is the full name of the club. I remember it because I'm a Bengals fan, so I would come to town for Bengals games. And there's like this hill. I don't know exactly what street it was, but like if you're walking up from the stadium, and Simon was kind of like on the right, and I was like, oh, there's like a gay club downtown, and I see a lot of Black people in there. So for me, like, I was like, oh wow, like there is a community and a presence, and that's where I met some of my first friends in Cincinnati, like at Simon's. So when I came back in 2017, Simon's had closed. So then it was like this search for like, where can I find that space? I do recall someone saying, go to Below Zero. And I remember going to Below Zero and I was like, this is so different than Simon's. It's really bougie. It's really white. And I was like, where are the Black people? And then someone was like, oh, there's this place called the Dock. And I remember going to the Dock before, but like this was a different iteration of the Dock. And I remember going there and being like, oh, like this is very different than the other spaces. And I thought it was nice that like Cincinnati had different kinds of queer spaces. Then I learned about Tilly's, and I learned about like Northside is very interesting because I don't feel like any bar here is not a little queer. So even if it's not a queer bar, like, when you go to C&D's, you're going to run into queer folks. Or if you go to Chameleon, you're going to run into queer folks. Like almost any bar in Northside I think Northside has traditionally had that tradition of being the gayborhood in Cincinnati because it's where Pride used to happen. But it's also nice to see queer spaces or spaces that seem queer friendly outside of Northside neighborhood or outside of OTR. I think a sign to me of the city's progress is that I see queer and trans people in a lot of places around the city, at least inside the Beltline, right? And I think that that's a sign that like people don't feel like I have to be in this neighborhood. So, I've hung out with my queer friends in Price Hill and felt very comfortable. I've hung out with people in Madisonville and felt very comfortable. So I think those are signs that the city is changing in general. Well, it's interesting because I think, even when I went to Below Zero, it didn't feel unwelcome. It just didn't feel like inclusive. And in a city that has such a strong Black population, when a place is really white, it almost seems intentional. It's like, and then I go to other places and I'm like, oh, this place is really Black. And so there was still that kind of like, not very many spaces that are both groups of people. I mean, I think it's interesting. I did find the main event, and the main event was interesting because it was one space for many years that like, it was the most diverse space I could find. Like you go in and there were plenty of white people and plenty of Black people. Although I do sometimes sense that there was a class thing there as well. Like really well-off, affluent whites didn't go to the main event, but nor did really affluent, well-off Black people, at least in my experience. It was kind of seen like you don't go there if you're of a certain, but I felt comfortable because it was like class became the equalizer in that bar. Like working class people, good folks that just come together to try to have a good time. I do think in my efforts to organize, there are places that we struggled with. So when I moved here in 2017, a friend of mine had started a collective called the Black Bear Brotherhood in Detroit. So Detroit was kind of the first hub, and I had started hanging out with a few of my friends who kind of identified as bears, and And so he would see pictures of us hanging out, and he's like, hey, have you ever considered like starting a chapter of the Black Bear Brotherhood in Cincinnati? And I was like, never really thought of it. And then there was a friend of mine, Anthony, who had a page. It was like Cincinnati Black, like Bears and Chubs or something like that. And I was like, hey, like, what if we kind of converted this into like a chapter of the Black Bear Brotherhood? And so we did, and we used to meet at Tilly's. There was an incident that happened there, I want to say in early 2019, after we had been there for a bit. And it was about music. It was like, what's his name? Donald Glover, but he goes by something else, right? Childish Gambino, the song like This Is America, right? Yeah. So, and they had video screens and they had the music. And I remember we were celebrating kind of the anniversary of being at Tilly's, and the video came on, and of course people are kind of grooving to it. And then all of a sudden, like the song gets cut off, like halfway through, like abruptly, not like let the song in, but just it gets cut off. And then the song that was put on after it had to be like Metallica or Guns N' Roses. It was like so different. And so it was very noticeable because people were like, what just happened? And there's some disputes about like what happened, why it happened. The rationale was that like, oh, we don't promote videos with violence. I was like, there are other videos that have violence, right? Like it could have been handled a lot better. And so, and then one of the bartenders that stood up for the Black Bear Brotherhood and said, nah, I was there, and like, that's what happened, and that shouldn't have happened. And that person got fired. And so we were just like, we can't continue to support this bar when like a white ally stood up for us and got, punished for it. So, I mean, there are those incidents, and like the rebuttal was like, that person isn't racist because they have like their best friend is Black. And I was like, that's just not good. Like, and I think to this day, we haven't had a restorative conversation in our community about racism. I've been to other gay spots in Northside where I know gay men have been gathering, and I've kind of walked in and like no one has spoken to me or even said hi. And so I think sometimes people in the queer community can presume that because they're queer, that they don't have other biases. And the hope for me is that we can actually confront racism within the LGBTQ community and the way that shows up. As someone that helped found and start Cincinnati Black Pride, it's been great to see white people at our events. For me, it's like, if Cincinnati Black Pride can demonstrate what it means to be inclusive more than these other organizations, maybe we lead the way in that, right? Because it's not, to me, about being separating. It's about creating spaces for a broader range of inclusion in arts and social spaces. So yeah, I mean, there have been those challenging areas. We also went to a space called Arts on the Ave after that, which is a mostly Black space. And about a couple of years after being there, they brought Umar Johnson to speak, who is notoriously homophobic, transphobic. And it was on the flyer. And then we had people calling from other spaces saying, is this the place y'all hang out? Like, what's up with that? And so when I talked to management about it, they were like, oh, like it's a rental. Like it doesn't really have anything to do with us. But they just didn't seem to care that you made a decision to bring a speaker to this establishment at a time when like Black queer men and queer people were doing a lot to keep that space afloat during the pandemic. So we stopped going there and we finally found a space, which is interestingly not even queer, is not particularly Black, but Somerset OTR is where we meet now. And we explained the history of how we had to keep moving to different spaces. And the management there was like, no, you are absolutely welcome here. All parts of you, we're going to make space for you to be Black and queer, and we're going to honor that space. And it's honestly been the best most welcoming space for us. But I'd like to see more Somersets, like spaces that are very intentionally about bringing people together. I did have a good experience recently. Jessica Diamond and the Bloom crew did a fundraiser for Cincinnati Black Pride. And I had never been to Bloom because quite honestly, I was like, I don't know. Is this going to be just like whatever? And so it was just great to see that there was an effort, but I hope those efforts can sustain beyond Black History Month or like, let's raise money for this, but like, how can we try to be more inclusive on a more regular, ongoing basis? So, again, because of my connections in other spaces, Earl Folks, who is the founder of what was the International Federation of Black Prides, which became the Center for Black Equity, I knew him and I came to Cincinnati and I was like, hey, like, does Cincinnati have a Black Pride? Especially after I went to the dock for a party and it was hundreds of like Black queer young people. And I just remember being like, whoa, like there's clearly a community here that I wasn't exposed to. And I think it was like, I want to say it was the night after I was told to go to like a Below Zero that I went to and I was like, it was like night and day. And so I asked around, and the last effort at kind of a Black Pride was when Doug and Greg Cooper Spencer did the Open Eyes Festival in 2009. And so I talked to Earl. I said, well, what would be involved in establishing a Black Pride in Cincinnati? Because I knew him, and he was like, oh, like, take these steps to this. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to try to start a 501c3 by myself. This very home on Pullen Avenue in Northside was the first meeting place in 2018 for Cincinnati Black Pride. So we would literally meet in the kitchen downstairs. What was really dynamic about that was that there were people in the room who lived in the same neighborhood who were both Black and queer and didn't even know each other. And so, you know, Cincinnati can be very neighborhood. Like if you live in College Hill, that's a different universe in Northside, which is a different space in Clifton. So Cincinnati Black Pride brought together a lot of people who hadn't previously had connections, and just building on that has been such a great joy to see that organization continue to grow as I step back in leadership and allow other people to lead and to see the organization grow. And part of that is like, you know, we want for people to feel like they have support in this community. And Cincinnati Black Pride, contrary to what some people think, it's not like, well, some people say, well, why can't you just have one pride? One is that it establishes that the way that Black queer people have had to navigate, you know, white gay racism, Black homophobia, means that it's okay for us to have our space and to participate. So when we decided to move Cincinnati Black Pride to Juneteenth, it was great. But the effort was, we want Black people to recognize that Black queer folks are part of the Black experience. And then we also march in the Cincinnati Pride Parade. That was an emotional moment for me because I remember our first Pride, that was 2018. And there probably was about 25 of us marching in the Pride Parade. I don't know that Black people en masse had ever done that before. And I distinctly remember the Black kids who were kind of on the side in their clusters with families. And I remember one of the kids called me over and he's like, I thought y'all were protesting. And so his association of Black people marching at a Pride event, the first thought was that they're going to be against it. So when he saw that, we were like, no, like we are Black queer people, adults, professionals. You could just see the joy, like, wow, like, and that's what I wanted for young people here, to see that like they can embrace both aspects of their identity here, that they can have mentors and guides and people who look like them, who share their experiences right here in Cincinnati. And so that's why that's always an important moment. I will also say one of my good friends and one of the people I met when I first visited, Phil Stowers, I remember him saying he always wanted to like carry a flag and walk through the Cincinnati Pride Parade as like a proud Black gay man. And he's one of the people that I found so inspirational because he was out here, and he was like vocal and speaking his truth even before we had organizations. And so for him to be able to come to that parade and finally be able to wave his flag as an older than me, like Black queer man, was like, we're not just doing it for the younger people. We're also honoring the people who didn't have these spaces to celebrate. My first Cincinnati Pride was in 2006. I'd become friends with Doug and Greg Cooper Spencer. I don't know if it was through them or because at that time I was a pioneering queer hip hop artist. I had started a group called DDC, or Deep the Collective, in the Bay Area. And so I was doing a lot of queer rap, and I got an email from someone at Cincinnati Pride, and they were like, "Hey, you want to come to Cincinnati and perform?" And I was like, "Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I'd be happy to come back." So I came to Cincinnati, performed in the Pride. Some of my friends came up from Kentucky, from like Louisville and Lexington and other places around. And that was kind of my first exposure to a Pride. It was in Northside at that time. I remember it being rainy on that day and it just felt like smallish. I think the rain probably deterred a lot of people, but it was also like the kind of resilience of that community. It just felt like I was really proud to be here. And then sort of fast forward, that's like my first memory of Pride. I moved back in 2017. So my first Pride is downtown. There are floats, there are banks, there are politicians. Everyone wants to be in Pride. So it was like a night and day experience. And I know there's been there's a lot of feelings about that. I personally am one that feels like anything that can amplify and make more visible Pride is not a bad thing. So I understand that some people miss sort of like the grit and determination sort of smallness of it. But I think, if these funders and money can enable Pride to have a bigger presence, and some kid is going to see, oh, like there's Cincinnati Pride this weekend, or like I saw the flags out, and I think in some small way that's helpful to kids who can't get to Northside. Right? You can say, oh, Mom, I'm going downtown. If you're queer, you can't always say, Mom, I'm going to Northside, because Northside has a reputation. So I think we also have to think about those kind of things when we want to critique sort of the establishment aspects of Pride. I think it's more nuanced, and I really want for young people to feel like they can go to places and feel welcome. I also remember, and this is not connected to Pride, doing a program at the Cincinnati Library with Siri Imani and some of the people from there. And I also remember like how queer friendly the library was for young people. And I was like, oh, like there was real inclusion. The kids that were, trans or non-binary were mixing and hanging out with the other kids. And it was just like, oh, wow, like the library has really created a safe space for young people here. And as an educator, that made me feel really proud, because Cincinnati doesn't have a youth LGBT center. And I kind of felt like the library had kind of become a space for those young people. And so through my work at Teach for America, we actually fundraised for books that we were able to place in the library with little prism stickers on them, as a way of saying to young people, hey, like, we want you to be able to have access to affirming LGBTQ literature. And I'm hoping that the culture war stuff doesn't impact our libraries, because they are kind of targeting libraries as well for having certain kinds of literature. And I think that's something that really concerns me. It's interesting. I think like seeing the kind of split, like starting Cincinnati Black Pride, one, I think my logic there was that we have to establish a community and a presence so that people feel like we are a force that people want to consider. So what I did find is that once we established Cincinnati Black Pride, we did have organizations We had Carico and HRC and Equality Ohio and PFLAG and GLSEN like come to us and say, hey, so I think there is a good faith effort to be more inclusive and to really support Cincinnati Black Pride. I still think that the next step is to have more representation and integration in the larger Pride experience, and not just sort of tokenistic, we need a few Black people here, but like, how are those people making some of the decisions about the programming that happens, about who's the performer? But I will say, I think because people would not say anymore that like Cincinnati's queer community is all white. I think that's something that has shifted. When we go to Somerset on a Thursday night and people are like, oh, they're like 30 Black men in the room laughing and I don't see any women. It's kind of like, oh yeah, they're Black gay folks in Cincinnati, right? And I think that that's important from just a representation standpoint. But I think it's also, for me, I don't want people to see that as like they're segregating themselves, but like, oh, there's an opportunity to engage, to figure out how we can do more stuff together. So, and I think some of that's happening. I've increasingly seen spaces and organizations like the, what's the Out Film Festival? Outreels, working with them on bringing like Black LGBTQ films and doing partnerships and collaborations. So, I think, and this is kind of the promise of a mid-sized city, that I think Cincinnati can get it right. Because guess what? New York Pride is segregated. Chicago Pride is segregated. So these issues are not unique to Cincinnati, but I think we're a small enough or mid-sized enough city that if we are very intentional, that we can actually work together to be one of the more inclusive, representative prides, where the Black Pride organization and the other Pride organization are really working together to demonstrate more inclusion. And that's what I think since I moved here from these other cities, what my friends are saying is like, oh, I had no idea Cincinnati had that community. Oh, I want to come visit. And so I've had people come and visit and experience Cincinnati. They're like, oh, I never would have expected Cincinnati to be that way. Or why do you still live there? And it's like, oh, because I love it, because I love my community here. I'll say I have a really close friend that was, on a job market, seeking opportunities. And, he's one of those persons, like, I'm not sure Cincinnati is going to really work out for me. He's not from here. And I had a very emotional moment probably a month ago when he was talking about the viability of getting this job somewhere else, but one that might allow for some virtual stuff or his ability to stay here. And he's like, I really like my community in Cincinnati. And this was someone that was like, I'm going to leave, So for me, I was like, if I'm playing a small part in creating a community where people are like, I want to stay in this community because there's something really special going on in Cincinnati. That makes me happy, because that's why I fight to stay, even though my job isn't even here. HIV is an interesting topic. So I've tested positive when I wasn't here. So I tested positive in 99. I was 26 years old. I'm 50 now. So it's like I'm almost 51. So it's almost like I've been positive like half my life. So in some ways, I've really been okay. I mean, it was a struggle early on, but I also tested positive in the Bay Area, in San Francisco, and probably one of the places where there was more awareness and understanding of people that are living with HIV than some other places. I will say when I came here, that's been the harder part. I think while a lot has changed, I remember going on a date with a guy. We got back to my place. And mind you, on my profile, I say I'm positive, so I guess they didn't read that. And so he starts to make out, or we start to make out. And I was like, hey, I just want to make sure And I remember telling him, and he was like, oh, okay. And he's like, you mind if I go use the bathroom? And I was like, oh, sure. And I point to the bathroom and I hear the front door close, and he left. And I just remember feeling like, oh, like I've been positive for 2 decades, like, but I went right back to that first moment of finding out and feeling scared and feeling like I was going to be rejected. And it bothered me that, like, why did I let that affect me that much? But I was like, it still hurts. Rejection still hurts. And that same person probably a few weeks later hit me back up and was like, I'm so sorry. Like, I just don't know. And I don't have the education. And is it okay to kiss people? And, so those kind of questions, which said to me that, like, we have a lot more education to do in Cincinnati around just HIV awareness. But I will say, on the plus side of that, I've had a couple of friends, Black queer men, who I think, because I'm very open and vocal about my status, who've disclosed to me. And like a couple of them I knew for years and didn't know that about them. And so I'm like, wow, like I'm starting to feel like I have community, that I'm not alone, that if I have questions or thoughts about HIV, that I have people who share my experiences to talk to. I still think there's work to do, but I think we are moving in the right direction with regard to that. And there is more awareness. Phil Wilson, one of my longtime international mentors, who was the founder of the Black AIDS Project, just a couple of Tuesdays ago, was here at Esoteric speaking. And there was a moment where I performed and Phil was kind of one of the featured guests. And he said, y'all need to, like, look out for Timem, he's he's a global icon who lives right here in Cincinnati. And I just remember being like, everyone was looking at me and I'm like, I'm a global icon. But to have a global icon call you a global icon was like a moment for me. And I think what he was saying is like you have someone in your community who's here. And I want to be used and leveraged more to share that message of awareness and that we can thrive with HIV. I am also aware of older friends of mine who lost a lot of friends, that HIV AIDS really impacted Cincinnati in a major way. There was a pastor at that particular event that I mentioned with Phil Wilson that talked about how he lost like half of his choir members because there was just the secrecy and the silence and the shame around HIV. But I do feel that like people are beginning to confront that a bit more, and just how can we be more visible? I mean, Equitas Health is here. So that's where I go for my primary health care. And I like that people ask me my pronouns when I go there. And I tell people in other spaces, oh, I go to this place that like, they ask your pronouns and they're like, in Cincinnati, I'm like, yeah, like we got that here. And then you have Caracol down the street. So that there are organizations and efforts that are trying to do the right thing. And I'm just proud. Like whenever I talk about Cincinnati and tell people the spaces and places where I have and can live fully into me, they're like, and this is someone that's saying that who lived in New York, who lived in Chicago, who lived in Houston. But part of it is like, I want the same opportunities I had there to be a part of community here in Cincinnati. But I will say that the fact that Obergefell, did I pronounce that right, happened, like was kind of located here. I also think, if I'm correct, wasn't the first couple to get married in Cincinnati a Black lesbian couple? I think one of the first couples was, and I remember I wasn't even living here and I saw that and I was like, oh, that's interesting. Also, when I brought my conference here, I met Pastor Leslie Jones and I was like, oh, there's a Black queer church here. Like, I was like, wow, like Cincinnati has definitely changed. I met Reverend Derek Terry, who I had seen on Ayana Fix My Life show, and he had his church here. I'm like, Black gay churches in Cincinnati. it was a lot. It was like, wow, like things are different. And, I feel like compared to a lot of other places I've been, Cincinnati's a lot more progressive than, again, if you're comparing it to New York and California, like, those are apples and oranges. But there are a lot of places that I go to and I feel like, oh, like we're doing better than this. So, anything I can do to help keep that progress going is important.